This is what people, when people always ask me, what is going on over there? That's a very typical American question. They ask it very broad. They're like, well, what is going on over there? And my response usually is that, well, everyone protests. You have Occupy Wall Street in this country. You have the Black Lives Matter protests and so on. So when people think that an injustice has occurred or their rights have been violated or, they're not, their economic welfare is not being respected, they come on the streets and protest. But the difference is that in a country like US, you don't really have to fear major instability that results from foreign influence and foreign manipulation.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. The unrest in Iran is hard to grapple with, especially as a woman. I have to start by saying we don't know what's going on there. While everybody has suddenly become an Iran expert, what little we know of the chaotic incidents of protest and violence is channeled through social media and Western media. As a secular leftist coming out of a Western tradition, I can't relate to wearing a headscarf, let alone having the state impose one upon me. As a student of other cultures, I know that for many men and women, it's a basic part of their identity and culture. As an anti-imperialist, I resent the notion that we Americans have to have an opinion on everything that happens everywhere in the world. And we have to make pronouncements about what must be done, or at a minimum, attach our name to some useless letter or statement, along with other journalists or academics, in some sort of futile virtue signaling. And I can't help but notice the collective arousal that seizes the West whenever there's the slightest hint of unrest in countries that are targeted for regime change, countries that are sanctioned and isolated, whose people are made to suffer specifically so that they take it out on their governments. And these governments are made paranoid because there are ongoing attempts at regime change, at sabotage and assassination and terrorism in order to overthrow them. As a result, no movement can develop organically or express itself without being associated or even co-opted by Western governments and NGOs. But before we confidently jump to conclusions based on snippets we see on Instagram, we should at least listen to real experts. And so it's my pleasure to once again welcome Navid Zarrinnal, a Columbia PhD and Iranian scholar at Stanford University. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews or by donating below on YouTube. Navid, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rania, for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. There's a lot to talk about, and I appreciate the fact that we can have a very nuanced conversation like this here. So to start off, can you just explain from we're hearing from different sides of this issue, what happened to Mahsa Amini that we do know, and then what are the claims from different sides? And of course, I'm speaking of the woman whose death in custody has sparked weeks of protest. And then we can go from there.
Sure. So Mahsa Amini was a 22-year-old Iranian woman from the Kurdistan province in Iran, and she was visiting Tehran, I believe, with her family. And at some point, she's taken into custody by the guidance patrol, what is in Persian in the popular culture is called Gasht Irshad, which literally translates to guidance patrol. Although in the Western media, you often hear the phrase morality police, but I don't think morality police captures the idea of Gasht Irshad well, because in the Iranian cognition, the distinction between legality and morality that you had in the European legal tradition didn't really occur in the same way. So I don't like to use the word morality police, but in the media you often hear that term morality police. But throughout the program, I will refer to it as the guidance patrol or Gasht Irshad. And this guidance patrol is actually under the purview of the police organization, or what in Persian is called Niroy Entezami. And their task is to enforce hijab. And so and a lot of times it's very arbitrary, but they look at women's wardrobe and what they judge to be bad hijabi or poor hijab. They take them into custody and they provide a citation to them. And what happened to Mahsa was she was actually at the Haqqani metro station, and the Haqqani metro station is actually in a relatively wealthy part of Tehran. So in Tehran, how the geography works is that if you go from south to north, it usually gets more wealthy, and Haqqani is situated towards the north of the city. And the Tehran metro system is very comprehensive, and there's a station in Haqqani. And then she was taken into custody at Haqqani metro station. And then she goes to the office where she's supposed to be cited in Wazara, and that's where she collapses. And so we have two different narratives here: the foreign media, the English language media, and also the Persian media that's coming out of places like London and New York and Berlin and so on. Their claim was that she was beaten, and their evidence is that there were eyewitnesses, and also based on the Twitter photos of her in the hospital, they're claiming that she was beaten, and this led to her death. And this is also on Wikipedia. So if you go on Wikipedia in English and Persian, on both versions, they're citing to the Western media and also the Western-funded Iranian media to claim that she was beaten, and the beating was the reason for her death. But then if you look at the Iranian media is claiming through the پزشک قانونی or forensic doctor, so the مدیر کل پزشک قانونی Tehran, which translates as the Tehran director for forensics, his conclusion was that Mahsa Amini had underlying diseases that caused her death. So she wasn't beaten. Rather, there are certain diseases that she had documented in the medical system, including brain tumor surgery that she did at the age of 8, and that caused her to collapse and then eventually pass away in the hospital. And they also claim, the Iranian authorities claim, that there's no evidence of beating, and they also released video footage where she gets into the van, and then she gets out of the van, goes to the station, and there's no beating in the video. And it's possible that they edited the video, or there's something that we're missing, but this is the story that we're getting from the Iranian authorities. And what the truth is, I don't know. I mean, as an independent observer, I don't have enough resources to really judge, but I think time will tell that which side is telling the story, or it might be something in the middle. But I think the bigger problem is not even the issue of beating, but rather the broader conversation that has emerged around the guidance patrol or the so-called morality police.
And of course, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in this case, none of us really knows. We weren't there to see. It could be either story. It could be a mix of both. And like you said, time will tell. And before we go into the protest that this has sparked and the form they've taken, I'm just, curious, what is your position on what the West refers to as the morality police, or the guidance patrol, as you're calling it?
Sure. So I would say Iranian women who actually have to deal with them are probably in the best position to have a judgment on them. But my personal position is that I'm against them, and they actually don't help the longevity of the Islamic Republic. And from a security and from a strategic viewpoint, it's also a problem for the government of Iran. And as a citizen of Iran, I'm also against it. I have a lot of friends and relatives who were taken by them and cited for what was perceived to be bad hijab. And I had an experience one time in a Muslim country when I was going to a mahrajan or a festival, and for some reason that day, I was wearing shorts that were up to my knees. And according to most schools of Islamic law, men can wear shorts that come up to their knees. But for some reason, they denied me entry, and they said, you're supposed to be wearing pants. And that experience itself was, I felt very uncomfortable. So I can see, what women go through when they have to deal with the guidance patrol. But I think what's also important to mention here is that if indeed there was a beating that happened against Mahsa, this is not a routine thing. So from friends and relative, numerous friends and relatives who have been stopped by the guidance patrol, I had never heard an account of beating or anything violent towards them. And I think Americans have a tendency to universalize from their own experience, and
Right.
they probably dealt with the U.S. police, and they think that the police everywhere acts like that. But in the case of the guidance patrol, it is not something that, at least anecdotally, I had heard before, that they beat women when they take them into the van for citations. And also another thing that I should mention about the guidance patrol that I think is a problem is that it has a class element to it. Because it is true that the vans are all over Tehran, and as I mentioned, the Haqqani metro station where Mahsa Amini was taken, that is in a relatively wealthy part of Tehran. But at the same time, if you are on foot or in public transit and you're not wealthy enough to own a car, you're more likely to encounter them because you're just on foot walking around the city and they could stop you. But if you're in your car, the chances are you will not encounter them. So there's also that class element to it that I think make the guidance patrol or the so-called morality police even a bigger problem.
Now, that's really interesting. And I do kind of want to get into some more detail about the hijab mandate in terms of like the reason it exists. But I also do want to note, I mean, this is an important conversation for Iranians to be having. But it almost upsets me that we have to be having it, but we're only having it because it's become so widespread in Western media as though it's like our business. But I do appreciate you laying that out. I do want to ask you, though, I mean, since you follow Iranian media, you are Iranian, I'm sure you're speaking to your family there. When it comes to protests in countries that are like on America's hit list, no matter what that protest is about, no matter what sparked it, no matter how legitimate it may be, it's pretty common for the US and its allies to try to use it to their advantage, to try to make it seem bigger than it is. And I'm not suggesting that these protests aren't as big as the Western media is saying they are. I have no idea. But what I want to ask you here is maybe lay out some nuance for us. So obviously there's been these protests taking place. There's no doubt we've seen video of protests. Some have been peaceful. Others have looked more like violent riots, including some violence against police, I believe, among the casualties so far from this round of protests. Many police have been killed as well. I'm not sure what the number of protesters is. I'm not really sure like what numbers to believe. After watching what happened in Syria, you never know what sources to believe, right? Because everybody has an agenda. But help us understand, there are legitimate grievances here, obviously, but there's also some manipulation taking place by the West. There also are obviously some violent riots taking place. So, what are you reading and hearing from, I guess, relatives? What's your take on what's happening inside? Neither of us are in the country, but you are in a better position than most of the rest of us are to have somewhat of an understanding of just how widespread these protests are and what they look like.
That's right. So, I think getting clear data is always difficult. And even if you're in Iran right now and even participating in the protest, you cannot see the entire country. It's not that, you can go to every corner of the country to see what's happening. So even from that vantage point, I think your experience will be limited. But from what I've been hearing and reading, it appears that they're smaller than the 2019 protests that were over the gas price hikes. So I think they're smaller than that, and they're also smaller than the 2009 green protests that happened in a response to what the supporters of Mir Hossein Mousavi thought were the stolen election by Ahmadinejad. So they appear to be a lot smaller. But regarding, I think they have a legitimate point, which is, the protest against the guidance patrol and the mandate of the guidance patrol. But what happens in a lot of global South countries, especially those that are in the resistance camp of things against US imperialism, is that a lot of times they're manipulated by outside forces to go in a different direction. And this is what people, when people always ask me, what is going on over there? That's a very typical American question. They ask it very broad. They're like, well, what is going on over there? And my response usually is that, well, everyone protests. You have Occupy Wall Street in this country. You have the Black Lives Matter protests and so on. So when people think that an injustice has occurred or their rights have been violated or, they're not their economic welfare is not being respected. They come on the streets and protest. But the difference is that in a country like US, you don't really have to fear major instability that results from foreign influence and foreign manipulation, even though, I mean, they claim that Russia can bring major instability to the US. I haven't really been bought on that argument. But so that's in the imperial core. But in the periphery, especially countries that are attempting to resist US imperialism, the problem is that anytime that there's a popular protest, it can be manipulated by the forces of empire. And I think that's something that a lot of Iranians on the streets are not very aware of, because they're actually getting their information from the foreign-funded medias.
I mean, and that's actually a really good segue to another question I wanted to ask you is, can you lay out for us in terms of media interference? Because obviously we're seeing media in the US. We see CNN in English and we see BBC in English, but there's a whole host of media outlets funded by the West that are, that Iranians are consuming inside Iran in Farsi.
That's right. Yes, so I mean, you have Iran International, which the Guardian broke the story on this, and the claim is that it is most likely Saudi funded. So that was actually a Guardian story, and then you also have Manoto that is coming from the UK, and the sources of funding for Manoto is not very clear. But both of those medias are very influential inside Iran. People get them through the internet and also satellites. And they basically provide a narrative towards regime change. So that is like one of their most like pressing agendas, and they actually have a big audience in Iran. And there's also Voice of America that's, I think, less popular, but they also have a big audience inside Iran. And what was the second part of your question? Did you?
Well, no, I'm just curious, like how that plays out in terms. Actually, let me add this to it. I'll add this as a second part of the question. And are those media outlets, are you watching what they're saying? And are they, I've seen some accusations from the Iranians that claims that these outlets are like encouraging violence. They're encouraging rioting, and they're pushing for protests that have, legitimate reasons to exist. They're pushing them into the camp of like demanding regime change, which is very different. I just want to point out those two things are very different. Obviously, the hijab mandate and the, guidance patrol is one issue. Regime change is or state collapse, which is what the U.S. would like to see in Iran, is an entirely different thing.
No, that's right. And so what they do is that they still operate professionally. So I mean, they don't directly say that come and change the government, but that's the narrative they build, push people in that direction. And I mean, I give you a concrete example. Actually, I know Iranians in the West, in say North American or European countries, that had travel tickets to Iran in October, and they actually canceled their ticket because their story they're getting from these outlets is that there is an imminent revolution that is about to happen. And yeah, so people cancel their travel plans. But I think if they actually go to Iran, they see that they can go and not have major issues. And yeah, so there is that. And I mean, I think what's also more important is that even though they don't have that direct calling for regime change necessarily, they still kind of try to report professionally. There are still major agents of misinformation. And this is not just the foreign-funded Persian media; it's also the Western media. And the misinformation actually has come to mean this kind of derogatory term for the fake news that's coming from Trump supporters and the right-wingers and so on. But I think the history is much longer. So if you actually look at Western press from its inception, so from the time that you have the printing press and colonialism going together. The imperial core has always been producing misinformation about the periphery and about the colonized countries. And I give you an example, again, from Iran. If you look at the 1950s, when Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup d'etat, when he actually nationalized the Iranian oil, and he was trying to move it away from British and American control. If you read the British press at the time, they presented him as somebody who was intransigent, somebody who had dictatorial tendencies. So they were creating a lot of misinformation and also misinterpretation of his politics in order to sell him as this madman and to generate consent for the U.S. assisting the Shah in overthrowing him. So this misinformation against the periphery, against the global South, against colonized countries has a very long history, and we're seeing it again. And I think it comes in three different forms. So one is that you get incorrect facts. So for example, most recently, a lot of the foreign-funded Persian medias were claiming that Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the current leader of Iran, is very ill and he's supposed to die very soon. But I mean, I think those were rumors, and very possibly they were generating those rumors in order to create more momentum for regime change, right? Because the idea is that if he's dying, there is that momentum. So you have incorrect facts, incorrect claims that are reported as facts. And then also you have other things like the inflation of numbers. So a lot of times they inflate numbers. I think they were doing it for the COVID, during the COVID pandemic. The Iranian media might have been underreporting it, but then here I think they were overreporting it. So you have that. But I think most problematically, at least from my vantage point, because I'm a scholar of history and literature and politics, is a Eurocentric interpretation that you get. So everything is kind of filtered through this Eurocentric lens, whether it comes to gender issues, issues of sexuality, the structure of governance. So everything is subject to these European standards. And when you report in that way, and when you write your stories in that way, that also distorts what is happening in the country. Go ahead.
No. I think you're making a really excellent point in that. And I actually wanted to ask about exiles, because there's also a lot of this coming from people who live outside of the country who have some really hawkish agendas. And I want to give some examples because they play a huge role. And I mean, this is a bit of a cartoonish example, but I think you're on the West Coast where a lot of really hawkish Iranian exiles live. And there are people who do want regime change, and that tends to be the kinds of people who end up getting the most attention when these kinds of things take place. I mean, we've seen it in, the recent past in terms of Syria. The most hawkish voice always got the most attention when it came to like Syrian Americans or Syrians that lived in the US. So anyways, here's just like an example. This person tweeted this to be funny, but it's not necessarily untrue. I'm going to play this clip of the kind of Iranian that we end up hearing from in mainstream US media.
We want you to come back on HuffPost.
Absolutely. And tell Netanyahu that I totally love and support everything he's doing. And if he wants to bomb Iran, I'm totally in support of him. I think that...
You're down for bombing Iran?
I'm down for bombing Iran only because I think that we should have invaded Iran instead of Iraq, because the Iranians would have appreciated it and they would have been liberated, whereas the Iraqis didn't want us there and they don't appreciate it. So sanctions on Iran, bomb the bad people in Iran and help them, liberate them. They want to be free.
I mean, okay, so that's like a bit of an extreme example, but it's almost like the perfect version of the kind of Iranian that the US wants to, like that US media wants to give attention to. And then I'll use a more recent example. I don't know if you want to say something, by the way, is that or about that specific person, or if you have any thoughts or reactions to the clip I just played before I moved on to the next.
Reza, I think I forgot his name, Farahan, I think is his last name. From the Shahs of Sunset. So he's actually, he was in a reality TV show, I think showing not Iranians, Persians, they call themselves Persians in California. And I've never seen it actually, but I think it was, a reality TV show showing these wealthy Persians in LA. But yeah, he is, that is just insane. I mean, watching that. And unfortunately, that view is not, he's not really an outlier. That, like, if you talk to a lot of Persians or Iranians in LA or California, they share his views.
And so I wanted to move on to somebody else who's, I think, more relevant in terms of politics, because that was just like some reality TV star. And that's this woman who was featured in this New Yorker article recently. I don't want to butcher her name. Is it Mahsa Amini?
That's right. Mahsa Amini.
So this is her right here. I'm just like scrolling through to show her photo. People may recognize her because she's been getting a lot of attention. People were actually quite angry because Dexter Filkins, who also wrote some terrible things about Syria as well, featured her as the one who's actually fueling the protests in Iran. This is actually a woman who doesn't even live in Iran anymore. I believe she lives in New York City, if I'm not mistaken.
She does indeed. Yep.
And the reason I bring her up is, okay, there's this entire lengthy piece crediting her with these hijab protests, and in many ways, it's anti-hijab protests. And in many ways, I mean, the reason that putting her at the center of this is so problematic that media will not mention when talking about this issue is the fact that she is very much in bed with the U.S. State Department. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that. So here is actually an article from Responsible Statecraft from, I think it was a couple of years ago, but it's still very relevant today. Here's the same woman. Here she is with Mike Pompeo. She's very close with American neocons. Mike Pompeo isn't just an American neocon. He's actually like a Christian fundamentalist end timer who's obsessed. He's obsessed with changing the regime in Iran. I believe him or at least his colleagues often speak at like MEK funded stuff. But what's important to note here is that this was back in 2020. And in 2020, she had already received more than $305,000 in contracts for her work at Voice of America Persia between 2015 and 2019. And that was back in 2020. I haven't looked into what she's been doing since then, but she's still very much, promoting the idea that we should overthrow the Iranian government, and any protest that takes place in Iran, anytime, anywhere. She immediately takes it from that protest, no matter how legitimate it might be, to this is why we need to overthrow the government of Iran, sanction it, and bomb it. And so these are the kinds of people that we're dealing with when it comes to these sorts of like exiles. So I don't know. I'm just curious if you want to react to that at all before I move on to the next question I have for you.
Yeah, and so this is how empires, sustain themselves, and also try to sabotage countries that are oppositional to them. They have a fifth column, or they have these oppositional exiles in the imperial core that produces the imperialist propaganda against their home countries, and also what is also referred to as a native informants. So there are a lot of these native informants working, across think tanks, universities, journalists, and so on, operating out of the U.S. and Europe. And yeah, so I mean, their politics is often very much intertwined with regime change, and sometimes, like Masih Ahmadinejad is more an example of like a hard regime changer. So they're more hard, but they're also the soft ones that still advocate for regime change to some extent. And what's interesting is also there's a big industry for the Masih Ahmadinejad types. And funnily, her first name Masih actually means savior. So I think she has this perception of herself as the savior of the Iranian people, even though a lot of times I think the Islamic Republic actually reacts to her activism. So if there are things that are happening organically in the country and the Islamic Republic backs down and relaxes some of the hijab laws, when they see the Masih Ahmadinejad types, they actually go in overdrive and react to that in a sense. So I think, if anything, a lot of times they're ineffective for the progressive movements in the country. But yeah, so there's a whole industry here for them too. A good example is the book production. So if you look at people who have been in prison in Iran, whether Iranians themselves or dual nationals or outright foreigners, when they come back to the West, they always have these lucrative contracts to write books about how oppressive and repressive Iran was, and there's a big market for that. So whether it's the prison, the Evin, we can call it the Evin industry, book production, or whether it's talking about oppression or repression in the country in other ways, there's a big industry, and I think these exilic intellectuals and journalists and pundits really have a big audience, and they work in collaboration with the government and think tanks to produce this information.
And then there's also the issue of, there's a few elements here. You mentioned there's like this industry, right? So it's like a career path. I mean, I know, for example, as a Lebanese American woman, tomorrow, if I started hating Hezbollah, I could get all kinds of jobs. I could probably get a job at some think tank in DC to just, my entire job would just be to make things up about Hezbollah and say how awful they are. So it's a great, I mean, it's a great way to make a career for yourself on the one hand, but also there are people with agendas. And I here specifically, I want to ask you about two types of people. There's the MEK, right? The MEK types who support what used to be listed as a terrorist group until Hillary Clinton's State Department was lobbied to take them off the terrorist group list. And then there's also the pro-Shah elements, people who literally want to bring back the Shah and reimpose that authoritarian dictatorship on Iran. So can you talk a little bit about those two elements, and have you been seeing them reacting to or trying to use these protests to their advantage?
That's right. So what happens is that a lot of times the MEK and the royalists kind of jump on these protests, and whether it's through their media or through their actual presence during the protests. So, I mean, I think in California, there were a bunch of protests arranged, and not just California, all over the West. And a lot of these well-intentioned university students go to the protests, but then what ends up happening is that all the MEK people and the royalists also show up. So it becomes this weird mixture. And even if the protesters are not going there with the aim of regime change, what ends up happening is that a lot of the people who show up who have links or ideological sympathy with the likes of MEK and the royalists, they also show up, and then it turns into a regime change type protest. And if you're curious about the MEK and their origins, there's a really great book written by my own teacher, Ervand Abrahimian, called The Iranian Mujahideen. And he kind of traces the history, because in the 1960s, they were actually an oppositional group against the Shah, and they helped bring about the revolution. But when the revolution happened, they had differences with the Islamic Republican Party, and they were not able to consolidate power, unlike the Islamic Republican Party. And then eventually they operated out of exile. And now they're actually stationed in Albania. They used to be in Iraq, but now they're in Albania for reasons I haven't really understood. But then they also operate from other countries as well. And like you mentioned, they have collaborated with the Americans, and they're one of I think the most organized groupings. And they also, with the aid of Israel, they carry out assassinations against Iranian scientists and so on inside the country. And then the royalists, I mean, they're the proponents of the return of Valiahd, or the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who lives in the U.S. But ironically, or I guess it's a big contradiction, Reza Pahlavi himself is actually not for monarchy. He supports constitutional monarchy, so he just wants to be a ceremonial figurehead and have a republic. So some of his supporters actually go to him, and they're kind of confused by this, right? And I mean, maybe he's not sincere. Maybe he actually wants to become a king, but at least in his public face, he always talks about a constitutional monarchy. But then the royalists who support him, they kind of they want a revival of the Pahlavi monarchy, and they think that the only right form of government for Iran is the monarchy. And I think the support for them is exaggerated, because if you talk to a lot of Iranians, again, in California, they would tell you that they're very popular, and Reza Pahlavi is very popular in Iran. And if he returns, he will become either the monarch or the constitutional monarch. But I haven't seen much evidence for that. I think he has lost he doesn't have that level of popularity to ever be able to revive the Pahlavi monarchy.
And of course, in all this, I mean, what are all these people advocating for? At the end of the day, you hear a few common themes, and not everybody. I mean, I know there are some people who really just want women to have a choice, and that's totally fair, and I get that, and I'm for that. But a lot of this ends up turning into, we want more sanctions on Iran, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening right now. You see, the Germans have announced that they're going to add more sanctions on Iran. The Canadian foreign minister, who I believe is like the granddaughter of a Nazi, Chrystia Freeland, has stated that that Canada is going to add. Interestingly enough, she talked about the women's rights and then said that that's why we're going to sanction more IRGC figures. But as far as I know, the IRGC does not police women. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it just shows that that's where they're taking this. They're taking this to a foreign policy goal of there's protests in Iran over women's rights. Therefore, let's sanction the Iranian government because we're sick of them supporting resistance in the Middle East, which two things that have nothing to do with each other. But my question for you is, for all those people who think that, who are seeing this response of sanctions, why are sanctions, if you actually care about women's rights in Iran, the wrong way to respond to this? Do sanctions on Iran help Iranian women? I mean, I think that answer is obvious, but please take it from there.
No, and I think you're right. And that's the other thing is this kind of, they don't even have the right comprehension or understanding of Iranian politics. So, they could be sanctioning the wrong people. And also the way the sanctions work is that they become this, like, they target everything. So a lot of times Iranians, like, for example, Iranians couldn't even access Zoom during the pandemic, if they wanted to interact, say, with Zoom. Zoom had blocked access because of the sanctions, even though I think most recently the Biden administration allowed these companies such as Zoom to actually have their, give a business to Iranian IPs. Not that they actually transact with money, but then if you open the Zoom application, you can actually access it. But before that, you had to run a VPN to actually access Zoom. So yeah, the sanctions actually harm ordinary Iranians, as you're mentioning, and also a lot of times they're confused and they're too broad, too total. And also, I think what they do at the end of the day is that this kind of media discourse, this supposed human rights discourse, is actually linked to the sanctions. So when you have this supposed rights discourse coming from a lot of the Western media, what happens after that is the sanctions, right? So these two work together. And I mean, I think international pressure can be very effective in a lot of contexts. So say apartheid South Africa or apartheid Israel. So I think the countries that are in some ways allied with the imperial core, where they don't have the prospect of regime change and major instability in the same sense, sometimes international pressure works to actually advance progressive agenda. But in the case of Iran, I think the sanctions and the pressure from the so-called international community, which is just the West and Israel and maybe Japan, what it does is actually delegitimizes the progressive movements and also obstructs their movement towards something better.
That's a really good point about delegitimizing progressive movements, and I'm actually going to get to that too. But I think it's actually a good sort of pivot point to talking a bit about the actual reality in Iran. Since you are Iranian yourself, you've lived in Iran, and you understand Iran, and you've also studied Iran. So can you tell us, to what extent are women involved in public life in Iran? And here I'm talking about in politics. Are there women members of parliament? Are there women ministers? Are there women nuclear engineers? And I'm not asking this so you'll say, yes, everything in Iran is great for women. Just a genuine curiosity about, the role of women in public life in this country that everybody seems to think they're experts on.
That's right. So historically, not just in Iran, but in the Muslim world more broadly. So if you look at pre-modernity and before modernization reforms, so pre-20th century, women were oftentimes tied to the home. So they actually own property and they also own businesses. But usually it was it was stationary. So it had to be tied to the household, where they would also take care of the domestic needs of the family. So they had a lot of stationary businesses, such as textile industry and textile production. And the men dealt with things that moved, and also dealt with the purchase and the sale of real estate and so on. But then what happens after modernization reform, including in Iran, is that women gain much greater mobility. And then they start entering professions that were historically reserved for men, right? And then today in Iran, so I mean, this happens under the Pahlavis, under the Pahlavi modernization program. But when the Islamic Revolution happens, they don't go back. They don't go back to pre-modernity, right? So they don't try to revive the traditional patterns of economy and mobility and so on. So they maintain the Pahlavi modernization in a sense. And a lot of women start attending, more women compared to the Pahlavi period, start attending schools and universities and so on. And today, based on some of the data I've seen, and the data varies, but based on the data I've seen, it appears that the majority of STEM graduates, so university graduates in the STEM fields, are actually women. So there are more women in Iran graduating, getting degrees in the STEM fields compared to the men. And also, again, going back to your question about the public presence, even though the veiling has imposed certain controls and has limited the choice of women in certain contexts and for certain social groups, it has also legitimized their public presence and their political agency, in a sense that before the veiling and before the revolution, the conservative establishment had an excuse that, well, you're not veiled, so you cannot come to public life. But after the veiling happens, more people become accepting of women actually participating in public life, because the idea is that they're following the Islamic dress code. So now we have a higher acceptance of them being in the public sphere. And there's actually really good work done on this because I'm actually not a scholar of gender and sexuality. So I'm just kind of telling my own take. But there's good scholarship on this done by Shahla Ha'eri, who I think teaches out of Boston, and she looks at the relationship between how veiling has actually produced greater public presence for women. And then when it comes to positions of power, I mean, I did mention that we have a lot of STEM graduates in Iran who are women, but then positions of power, especially in politics, they're mostly dominated by men, as is the case in most other places in the world. It's usually men who have the highest authorities when it comes to business and politics and so on. So that's still true, despite women, getting a higher education and a STEM education. But then when you actually live in Iran and work there, even though men are, officially they have the higher titles, a lot of times you feel like the women are running the shows. So if dealing with a bureaucracy, going to an office, in the workplace, it feels like the women, even though they might be managing things from the bottom, they still have this very fierce attitude that they don't take crap from men, and they seem very strong, and it seems like they're running the show if you actually live there and work there.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, even in the US, there's a struggle with representation of women in politics, even certainly in STEM. That's a pretty universal issue. That's not to absolve any country of not having equal representation. But, I'm also curious, why the hijab mandate? I've seen different arguments about this. I haven't read too deeply. I haven't seen much academic work on the issue, but obviously the hijab mandate came into place after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. What was the reasoning for this? Is it just because with, Islamic law comes a hijab mandate? Was there a class element to this? Was there an identity element to this? What was the reason back then?
That's right. No, that's a great question. And I think class and identity are both relevant. But in order to understand the Islamic Republic's laws on mandatory veiling, I think some history is important to understand what they were reacting to. And so if you look at pre-modern Iran, and so pre-modern Iranian history is usually categorized as before 1906, because in 1906, Iranians had what was called a constitutional movement or a constitutional revolution that was demanding a constitutional monarch and liberal reforms, even though the discourse around it started in the late 19th century, the demand for modernization. But before this, so in the 19th century and before the early 20th century, the hijab was a given, right? Similar to how now, say there's no social movement to do away with baseball caps or, with whatever people wear. The idea that, I don't want to wear the hijab was just not there. The hijab was a given, was part of the fabric of society and part of, the way women dressed. And there was no challenge to it. There was no social movement or literary movement challenging it before the late 19th century. So the earliest challenges that you see to the hijab in the Iranian context is from the Babi movement, that was a messianic and reformist movement in the middle to the late 19th century, and you see some opposition to veiling in that movement. But it really takes off during the constitutional movement of 1906 that I mentioned. And you also have a lot of women's associations, schools, and journals that are dealing with women's issues that emerged during the constitutional movement, and they kind of grow by the 1920s. And some of their demands includes the modernization of the dress code, that they want to change how women used to dress. But then what happens is that when it really takes off and it goes from the civil and social level to the state and political level is in the 1930s. And so the first Pahlavi monarch, Reza Shah, who was the father of Mohammad Reza Shah, who US supported, and he ruled from 1953 to 1979. So the father ruled from 1921 to 1941. And then in the 1930s, so from 1936 to 1941, he actually has unveiling mandates. So his policy was that in order to become more like the West, and in order to become supposedly progressive, the Iranian women have to take off their hijab. Right. So he even went beyond the constitutional movement, because for the constitutionalists, it was supposed to be a choice, right? The idea was that, the women should have the ability to choose what they wear. But with Reza Shah, the idea was that you should unveil completely in order to be supposedly progressive. And I give you an example of what he did. So he used his police force, including physical force, to enforce the unveiling mandates. Wow. And also he used other coercive measures. So in the spring of 1935, he pushed the Ministry of Education, Wizarat Ma'arif, to enact regulation that barred girls who wore the veil from receiving their diplomas. And also, if the teachers were wearing the veils, they could not receive their salary, right? So it was that coercive. And then there were actually a lot of protests organized by the ulama, or the clergy, in cities like Mashhad, that was a holy city, hosting the shrine of the 8th Shia Imam. And there were protests by the state. There were raids on the protests by the state, breaking them down, right? So a lot of coercive measures in order to enforce the unveiling law, or rather unveiling rule, because it wasn't actually passed in legislation at the time. And this was actually in sharp contrast to Ataturk, the reformer from Turkey, because the Turkish police actually never forced the unveiling. Rather, Ataturk had discouraged veiling, and it was only banned for women who work in the public sector, right? So similar to the French case with Ataturk. He just didn't want women, such as teachers in the public schools, to wear the veil, right? But then he did not have a police force that would go and force people or women from taking the veil off. And so the population was actually largely opposed to what Reza Shah did. And I think part of, it really, like, that trauma from what Reza Shah had done kind of continued. And then when the clergy got power in in the 1980s, they reacted to that, and they imposed the mandatory veiling. And I'll give you one interesting example from how traumatic it was for the Iranian population in the 1930s, where they had to unveil, that women did not want to be seen in public without the veil. So a lot of times when they wanted to go outside, their husbands would put them in a large bag or some sort of transit where they would not be seen, and then take them out. And there are examples of actually a man carrying his wife in a large bag, so pretending that he's just carrying goods, in order to take her to the public bath, because in the 1930s, a lot of households did not have showers, right? So you have to go to the public bath in order to take a shower. And so the women would be put in bags and taken by their husbands to the public bath, because the women themselves, they did not want to be seen in public without their veil. And then so the Islamic Republic reacts to this in the 1980s and imposes these rules on mandatory veiling, the very opposite of Reza Shah. And the problem is it became attached to the identity of the revolution and the identity of the Islamic Republic. And so now if they want to take it off, the idea becomes that, we appear weak when the West looks at us. So it has become
especially when, like, the enemy West is the one demanding it, right? Like when the enemy West is making it like a Western cause. That's really interesting. I was not aware of that history at all. I think a lot of people just assume that part of it was, obviously it was religious revolution. So part of it was based in religion, but then also just like it kind of is anti-Western, but like an anti-Western we don't want to be like the West thing. But, you know, can you also just like maybe give us an idea, your last trip to Iran, when you're in public spaces and restaurants, what, like, we've often heard, I know it's different depending on geographically where you are in Iran, whether a place is maybe a little bit more liberal, a little bit more conservative, but the sort of image that you see of a typical woman in Tehran is of like a veil that's like kind of, a little bit below her hair, right? So like her hair is somewhat showing. It's almost like a style. So I'm just curious, like, what's it like? Is it just a hint of a scarf or sometimes no scarf? Or is every woman always veiled? And like, how widespread is the sort of citation process as far as you've observed? Obviously, I understand you're not a woman, so you're not in a position to speak from your own experience, but being in Iran.
That's right. Yeah, so you're right. So I mean, a lot of women, they just wear a shawl, and you can see, their hair and their neck and everything. And a lot of them don't even wear an overcoat. They just wear a long blouse with jeans. So if, say, a Muslim woman who observes hijab laws comes and sees them, they might think that it's not, they're not really wearing the hijab, right? Mm-hmm. And again, in a lot of contexts, it's tolerated. So, if you're at cafes, libraries, especially more intellectual spaces, you see women just, like you said, wearing this scarf, down. Like sometimes it's just like fallen, and you can see, the whole hair and everything. And yeah, so there's that. And then, the guidance patrol, it's not like they target it's similar to masking rules, during COVID. I mean, the thing was, it wasn't like, everybody would be kicked out of the establishment for not having a mask. Or, I mean, in some countries, I heard the police would actually cite people. But usually, if you didn't have a mask on, a lot of times, like, you could get away with it, right? So it's similar in Iran with the hijab laws, is that a lot of times they're not enforced. And, the guidance patrol only has so many resources to enforce it. So a lot of times, like you said, the hijab is not worn according to the law. And also, I think what's interesting is we also have to look at it, again, bringing it back to the issue of modernization and colonial modernity, is that the very form of hijab, its identity and the way it looks, has changed in the 20th century. Because if you look at before modernization in the 19th century, Iranian women in the urban spaces wore what was called a chador, which is a loose, sleeveless piece of cloth that covers the whole body, and then piche or a picha, which was like a niqab or something that covered, their face. So that's what they wore. But then starting in the 1920s, the piche actually kind of falls from people don't wear it anymore. They just wear the chador. And then what happens after the revolution is that the black chador, so you've seen it, on TV, probably when they're talking about the Revolutionary Guard, they also show women in the black chador. That became the sign of supposed piety after the revolution. So the idea was that if you're wearing the black chador, you're the most pious, you're the most revolutionary. Sometimes, the two were separated, but the black chador became a sign of supposed piety. And then on the other side, the very opposite of it is that women who only wear a shawl and a blouse with jeans, and usually they're making a statement that I do not want to be wearing the hijab.
Yeah. And then is it true that under Rouhani, the morality police like virtually disappeared from life, but then were re-empowered under Raisi? And I know you call them the guidance patrol. I'm like using these interchangeably.
Yes. No, please feel free. Yeah, it's just a nuance that I like to point out regarding the concepts. But yeah, that's I heard that before from a lot of people, but I don't think it's true, because I was actually in Iran during the Rouhani administration, and there was one time where I was meeting one of my friends, and she got stopped in Meydan Valiast, the Valiast Square, which is one of the most busiest squares in the city. And she was actually taken to Wazara, but then I think she just got up and left. She actually didn't get cited or anything. I don't know the full story, but that was during the Rouhani administration. That's one anecdotal example that I have. And I remember people were still complaining about it back then. But I think rhetorically, the reformist, the Islah Talab side is a little bit more likely to oppose it and say, this is not right. And I think Rouhani had a speech that said you cannot forcibly take people to heaven. And I think he was referring to the guidance patrol that, this is just not right. I haven't heard Raisi say anything about it. I mean, he did, even after the death of Mahsa Amini, I'm not sure if he said anything about it, that was oppositional. But I think the rhetoric, it's with the principalists, you don't get as much rhetoric against it. Even the Ahmadinejad also spoke against it. And also Qasem Soleimani had also spoken against it. He was
really,
he had oppositional.
That's the guy. The guy, the general, the U.S. killed, the U.S. murdered under Trump. I will just point that out. Qasem Soleimani. That's interesting. I didn't know that he had spoken out against it. What did he say?
He said that these are all our this is like the Iranian nation is one big family, and they can be like your sisters and your mothers, and basically you're violating their privacy by doing this. I mean, I don't think you use the notion of privacy, but the idea was that you should treat them like your sisters and your mothers, and this is not this kind of coercive institution that takes them away and cites them is not it's just not right etiquette.
Well, I mean, it should upset everybody that the U.S. murdered an Iranian feminist icon, it appears, on top of somebody who helped save the region from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Speaking of which, I just want to point out the hypocrisy. I mean, it goes without saying, but I do need to say it because it is striking to me that, this conversation is happening and it's really being led in the West by people who have nothing to say about Saudi Arabia, or if they do, it's an afterthought. And Saudi Arabia's system of compulsory, I mean, I believe it's like a compulsory niqab that you have to wear in Saudi Arabia, which is literally just your eyes show in certain parts, at least. Moreover, they actually have what's called a guardianship system, which means a woman is like literally treated like a child. You can't go places without the permission, or I believe like being escorted in some cases by either like a father, a husband, or a brother. So I just, the same people who are fine with that situation because Saudi Arabia doesn't fund any resistance in the region. On the opposite, it's Saudi Arabia is in fact a proxy of American imperialism in the region. And whereas Iran is, has significantly more rights than women, still has more rights to go. But, it's just the hypocrisy couldn't be more in your face. I mean, I'm just waiting for MBS to come out and declare his support for the female-led protest in Iran.
Yeah.
But
also there was that hypocrisy with MBS. Also, I think it was in 60 Minutes that he said, "Well, Iran is actually responsible for Al Qaeda." So that was also
that's complete projection, man. It literally Bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda, is Saudi. I mean, it doesn't get more. I don't even know what else to add to that, but. You've been mentioning a few anecdotal examples, so I'm curious, what is the conversation inside Iran? Because it does sound like there are a lot of, complaints about these police are annoying. Maybe I don't want to wear a hijab. I don't need someone policing my clothing. And I think that's a good conversation to have. Is that a common conversation inside Iran?
That's right. No, that's a great question. And I would say that when it comes to conversations about problems and injustices, the Iranians actually it's a lot more dynamic than it is in the U.S. Because I've noticed in the U.S. The so-called critical thinking and like intellectual thinking usually converges with state ideology, right? So I mean, in your own work, I think you exposit this very well. That the mainstream media, the media that most people consume, they actually converge with state ideology. I mean, it's just like the two sides of the same coin. But in Iran, it's actually very different. In Iran, the civil society and the journalistic society, and also the nation, they have an oppositional approach to the state. And what happens is that if the state has a particular ideology, is pushing a particular position, usually the nation tries to diverge and they're very skeptical, to the point that the skepticism can kind of go into the conspiracy realm. But at the same time, they have this kind of, that is the identity of modern Iranian nationalism, is that you take an oppositional approach to the state, as opposed to the US, where the nation and the state are kind of very, cozy and cordial with each other. And I think the whole idea of state-controlled Iranian media, a lot of that stuff is projection. I mean, it is true that there are certain medias in Iran that are close to the leadership, or they're close to the Revolutionary Guard. But then they don't necessarily always parrot everything. And then there are also all these other medias that people consume that are coming from inside Iran that have a different approach, and a lot of intellectuals and journalists and academics who have a very different approach. But the thing is, in the West, because I think they're still going on with that old Orientalist discourse of Oriental despotism, they think that, in those countries, there's this despot that micromanages everything and programs everyone's brains, whereas here, they're free and they're thinking freely. But I'm not convinced by that. And I think it's actually, there's a lot of evidence for the opposite analysis. And so there is, I think, a large critical discourse on the issue of hijab, and it has been going back to the past 43 years. So I mean, from the very moment that the Islamic Republic imposed laws on mandatory veiling, there was opposition to it, and there's still conversations happening, even from inside the clergy. So there are members of the clergy who might be opposed to it too. Mm-hmm. I think one important point about the critical discourse is that it can also go really far in a sense that there's this idea of self-misery in Iran, or badbakhti, that goes, so it's the Persian word for this badbakhti, and it goes back to, again, the discourses of late 19th century, the modernization discourses. And so the idea became that the Iranian national self is inadequate and inferior compared to the outside world, in particular the colonialist West, right? And the discourse is so powerful that it's really an institutionalized way of thinking. So it's mutually comprehensible between Iranians. So if you're just going to the store to buy some fruits, or you're going to the gas station, you're talking to your Iranian peers, Iranian countrymen and women, you can be like, oh, everything is going to crap, everything is terrible here, and they agree with you. There's this kind of internal conversation that happens. I would compare it to the discourse of freedom in the U.S. So I think Americans have this notion that they're free. It's a false notion, but they have this false notion of freedom that's very institutionalized, like the narrative on liberty and freedom and so on. But in Iran, it's actually a narrative on self-immiseration that has been institutionalized. And even though the government does not push it, when it comes to Iranian social life, it's very central. And I think that kind of goes into the internal conversation and also turns into protest, right? And it has a good element because it holds power accountable. But I think on the negative side, it becomes a little bit destructive, because anything that the revolution has achieved, a lot of Iranians who are kind of operating under this discourse, they dismiss. So, I could be talking to, my friends, or, the fruit seller or the bodega guy, and I talk about, the revolution has achieved all these things, and you have all these things in Iran that you might not have in other countries because they're dependent on the imperial core, and they just don't get it. They go back to the discourse of misery, and they say, well, no, we're actually very miserable here, right? And then that discourse of misery goes to the protest, and then it goes into the idea of this discontent.
It really does. I mean, look, every country has its internal problems, whether it's in the imperial core or whether it's in the global south. And even if it's a country that promotes, resistance to imperialism, obviously there's a lot of contradictions inside those kinds of countries as well. And it's really unfortunate that the constant interference and the constant desire of the imperialist countries to utilize anything to their advantage to destabilize any country they hate makes it, or becomes this huge obstacle for anything organic or legitimate to actually work in certain countries. I mean, this makes me think, in so many ways of Syria. I mean, obviously Iran and Syria are very different countries. But Syria has so many and had so many internal problems. And when protests arose in Syria, some of those protests were legitimate. They were quickly, obviously, hijacked and taken over by these collection of jihadist groups that Iran actually played a huge role in helping to prevent from taking over the entire region. But I guess my question for you here is does this lead to a conclusion of protest? Can protests ever work in a country like Iran when it's immediately manipulated by the West for the purposes of regime change? I mean, I feel really depressed about the fact that maybe it can't be. And even you were talking about how because of the West taking this issue and turning it into a regime change issue, it becomes even less likely that something like a hijab mandate will be removed.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that goes back to that issue of international pressure. To what extent is the international moralizing and the international solidarity effective in a country like Iran that's so vulnerable to regime change? And I mean, I think it's a very difficult issue. And one of your other guests, Joseph Masad, has done really good work on this issue when it comes to the issue of sexuality. So how what he calls a gay international, actually in its attempt to have solidarity with alternative expressions of sexuality in the Arab world, um, actually produces problems for these alternative sexualities. Right. So it's this idea that you export the social movement in the West elsewhere in the world. And what ends up happening is that it doesn't help for those countries to have their own indigenous progression towards something better. Right. And it's not just the gay international. I think you also have it with the issues of gender, politics, economics. Right. And I mean, in the last time I spoke to you, I was trying to give the kind of the concept of a theocratic democracy and say, well, in the Iranian context, these two things can work together. But if you approach it from the European perspective or the Western perspective, it doesn't, right? And then again, when it comes to sexuality and gender, we have different issues in our countries. And the problem with the Western approach is that they don't understand this and they try to universalize their own progressive movements, thinking that whatever they have achieved here, it would translate over there, but that is not the case. So I think a lot of times it's just best for the so-called international civil society to just stay quiet. Like they don't have to have an opinion on everything, and they don't have to export everything that they have achieved here elsewhere in the world. And I mean, another crazy thing I saw with the Mahsa Amini protests is, a lot of the Iranian protesters had this slogan of "Be Our Voice," and I don't think that's a very effective approach. And when "Be Our Voice" can really be this kind of exactly, but who it's
like Pompeo?
Also
like
Pompeo, and also even if it's the more civil society elements like intellectual and journalists, a lot of times they're well intentioned, they're not like Pompeo in their intentions, but at the same time, because they don't really understand the political landscape and the cultural landscape, they just end up universalizing their own supposedly progressive movements to elsewhere in the world, and that does not help. You have to understand Iranian historical difference.
Yeah. And of course you do see, you're right, you do see these very well-intentioned people who are like declaring their solidarity with the Iranian Revolution. And I'm like, what the hell? Do you know what you're saying? Like I just the way the word revolution so easily gets thrown around. They did this with Lebanon a few years ago too. There was like protests for a few months. And it was a revolution. And I'm like, do you know what revolution means? Like, and do you know like what you're playing into when you say that? Like, think about what you're saying before you say it. Or maybe like, I don't know, if you don't know that much about a place, maybe don't talk about it. You don't have to have an opinion on everything. You really, really don't. But I do understand there's well-intentioned people out there. I want to show an example of how not to show solidarity.
Sure.
You've seen this. You've seen this before.
Yeah.
This is not.
Let's see.
You've seen this. This image I'm showing. This is a image that is basically an advertisement for a spring 2023 new gender issues in women's literature in the Middle East class that's being offered at Arizona or the University of Arizona.
Chomsky also teaches that.
Oh, okay. Oh, he teaches at the University of Arizona. Okay, so I hope he's not teaching this class. I don't think
he's not.
Chomsky would teach this class. But so it says, for those who are just listening, it says, in light of the killing of Mahsa Amini, Iranian women's protests and the fight for democracy as a case. And then this, it's really the cartoon that gets you. I think this is a really offensive cartoon. It's like the Ayatollah and his beard is like basically over, like is also a hijab that's like enveloping a woman's head, and she's trying to cut the beard / hijab off. And then it just goes on to say that this course usually this course is supposed to be a literary works course, by the way. It says that. It says it's a literary works course by women, written by women, for women. But this year, given the extraordinary events in Iran, it will pay more attention to Iranian women's literature and their social movement. Anyways, I'm just curious your thoughts on this. Can you explain why this is not
Yeah.
how to show solidarity with Iranian women?
No, I mean it looks ridiculous. I mean, for one, it's supposed to be an educational environment, and you're offering a course, and it just looks like a propaganda poster. And even the description is like this activisty, kind of like propaganda description. Say, I was teaching because I do teach on colonialism, and so I was teaching a course on colonialism and like British colonialism. I wouldn't have a caricature of the Queen, as a class poster, because I know that I probably have students who might have the wrong opinion, but they might be pro-empire for some reason. They might think that British colonialism did good things for, Africa and Asia, which I don't think it did. And I think through the class, I would teach them that it did not. But then I wouldn't come with that posturing. I wouldn't come with that posturing making a caricature of the Queen, and it would actually not be effective for their educational experience. And so here, we have an example of a reputable university actually getting entangled with these kind of regime change activism that is just very mind-boggling, like looking at this. And I understand, say, the professor has a particular position, say the professor really hates the Iranian government, that has that bias, but then at least, try to be more neutral in the way you offer the class.
Yeah, and a lot of these points that are made in on the side here that are bulleted about what we're going to talk about in this course. It's all about feminism in Iran and the Middle East, and in women's social life, and secular approach to social life, and this was the same discourse used towards Afghanistan. And interestingly enough, towards Iraq, by the way, where women actually had a lot of rights in Iraq, more than, women were more visible in public life in Iraq before 2003 than after. The U.S. actually created a hellhole for women in Iraq. They did the opposite of liberating women, but the discourse of feminism and women's liberation was something you often heard from those who were advocating to invade Iraq. And so this is very disturbing discourse to see from people claiming to be feminists, because there's nothing feminist about sitting inside the imperial core and essentially advocating regime change. Change. Like, people don't understand what regime change means. Regime change doesn't mean you just take one government and switch it with the other. Regime change is nasty. It requires state collapse. It requires completely shattering a society and a civilization. The countries that we've already done that to in just the past 20 years still haven't recovered from it, and they probably won't for the next century. So I feel like that, is important to recognize. And I thought this was a really good example of how not to show solidarity. But that's, I guess, right. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I was just going to say, because you mentioned Afghanistan, one funny thing that came to my mind was that, after the the killing of George Floyd and the George Floyd protests, there was kind of like a moment for about 1 year where white Americans were kind of like, I'm just going to step back and just be a listener and an observer. And, I'm going to show my allyship and, all that stuff. But then when the withdrawal from Afghanistan was happening, all that stuff got canceled, So now the idea was, and I have to intervene again, and I'm no longer a listener, I'm really a savior again.
I'm a savior who has to talk and tell everyone in the rest of the world exactly how they should live, and take and pretend like I'm leading movements in places I've never been to, nor do I even speak the language of. It's just utterly, it's American arrogance. It's imperialist arrogance, even sometimes from those who don't mean it. But I guess, I think a good place to end on here would be maybe, predictions. How serious are these protests, and where will they go? Because, from what I've seen over the last 10 years even, is every time there's protests in Iran, it's played up for weeks to a month, sometimes a couple months by the Western media. This is our chance. Regime change. It's finally coming. And then it kind of disappears until the next time. Does this time seem different? Or do you kind of foresee something similar happening here? And then I guess, moreover, not to add more for you to remember, I can remind you of this if you're like, let me answer the first before I answer the second. But do you see this leading to any changes in Iran, or because of everything we talked about, it's likely to just stay the way it is in terms of the mandate?
Go ahead. No, those are great questions. But then as a historian, I'm very reluctant to give
Of
predictions
course.
because
Historians
usually we
always
study.
are. Come on. Why are historians like this?
No, we study the past, not the future. Just because that's like think tanks do that, right? Think tanks are always like, I'm going to give a prediction for what will happen. And also, I'm afraid to give predictions because I'm worried of becoming a meme because there are meme pages like this, age really well. I'm sorry, this didn't age well, so I could say something and then in 10 years, they're like, well, that didn't age well.
Someone's gonna clip the next like 30 seconds to 2 minutes and be like, Navid got it wrong.
Yeah. So, but no, I mean, if I had to speculate, and again, it could be a false prediction, but it seems like, I mean, they're already dying down. I mean, despite the reports that we're getting, and see, again, going back to the misinformation issue, sometimes it's very difficult to know what's happening. So, I mean, most recently, I think today and yesterday, there were reports that the workers at the petrochemical and the oil industries in south of Iran are on a strike, and they have joined the protest. But then I also saw reports today that it was just a minor protest, I think in Bushehr, only the city of Bushehr, not even Abadan, where some of the major refineries are. And it was a very small segment of workers who were not on contract. They were just workers who were paid by the day. And I think they were protesting because of their economic condition. And it wasn't even directly connected to Mahsa Amini's death. So yeah, it's not clear, the information we're getting, and it could be that it's getting bigger. But my assessment is that it's actually not getting bigger, and I think that the biggest stage was, the beginning of the protest, the first week of the protest, and now it's dying down. And like 2019, I don't think it will lead to any major changes in the institutions of the government. But regarding the guidance patrol, that's something that we have to wait and see what happens. But I think, again, because of how politicized it is and how the whole discourse and the whole politics around it is threatening the identity of the Islamic Republic, they will not really let go easy of these rules. There's also the possibility that they maintain the guidance patrol, but that they just won't, similar to what you were mentioning about the Rouhani administration, even though I don't think it's true. But I think they might maintain it as an organization. They have some presence on the street, but they don't actually enforce the rules. That could be also the case. But I think, I mean, not in the short term, but in the long term, the Iranian society and also the government is moving in the direction of disbanding the guidance patrol. If I had to give a prediction that might or might not age well, that is one of them.
Well, you added that caveat, so people can't use it. You were uncertain. It was just a speculation.
That's right.
But thank you, Navid. I want to thank you so much for spending more than an hour with me, breaking all this stuff up and really explaining it for those who are very curious about what's happening inside Iran and why. I really appreciate you joining me, and hopefully we can have you back on sometime soon.
Thank you, Rania. It was great speaking with you.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest Breakthrough News content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.